a little bit about the death system. So here's the interesting piece, and we've kind of talked about this a little bit last week when we were in class together, just about what death means. And it's really important for us to really ascertain not only sort of the legitimate definition of what death is, but also what death means to our individual clients that we're working with. So when we're looking at kind of a definition of what death means, it's really the cessation of our brain waves, okay, that are, when that happens, we will consider people to be brain dead. So we can keep people breathing, we can keep their heart going through artificial means, okay? But really, on the medical side, when we are determining if someone is dead or not, we are not looking so much at whether or not their heart is beating or they're breathing, because we can do that artificially. It's more of when the brain waves are no longer communicating with the body. So oftentimes you will hear people say, this person is brain dead. And that means that their brain waves are no longer communicating and directing all of the different organs and parts of the body. So this is an interesting piece because oftentimes people, we have heard stories in the news about people who are comatose, right? And so oftentimes when people are comatose, they still have brain functioning, and so they're not considered dead, but they are comatose. So just to find distinctions there. Another piece of this is sort of this figurative, what does death mean to people? So, you know, in my own experience, I've had many people come in and say, this person is dead to me. Well, they're not dead, right? They're figuratively no longer part of that person's life. And so it's important for us to talk with our clients and ask them and help them sort of grapple with what death is, what that looks like, and what they believe happens after or in the process of dying and after death. So, okay, let's also just talk, I know I'm talking fast, about the death system. And this is something that Kassenbaum presents in the text that you're reading this week. And the death system is a systematic way that society sort of comprehends, understands all of the elements and responses that we have to death as a society, okay? So there are different elements of the death system and things that help us as a society understand the death process and what all the elements are associated with death. There's a function in the death system, which is the next slide and the last slide we'll go over as well, and we'll go over that too. But when we start thinking about the death system, and again, this is directly from the Kassenbaum text, but it's really important, particularly when we're looking at mass tragedy, but this can be used on the individual level as well, is that as a society, who are the people that are sort of involved with the death system as a society that we would say, oh, yes, they're involved with that death piece? Places, times, objects, and symbols. So let's just kind of work through these and kind of understand each of these pieces. Death, when you think about death and you think about people, who are the people who are involved, right? You know, you think about funeral directors, you think about clergy, you may think about hospitals and doctors and physicians, you might think about first responders, you might think about funeral directors, right? These are all people that we think about. So again, the death system oftentimes applies in mass tragedy, makes it very clear. So take this, for example. think about 9/11. And there's so many, unfortunately, mass tragedies that we could apply this to. When you think about 9/11, you do think about the first responders and the firefighters and the EMTs. And you think about, I think about the Coast Guard that came in to New York to help. We think about the police officers. We think about the communications people in that. These are all people. I think about the people of New York, right? And their experience of this mass tragedy. So those are the people. Then let's look at the places. So when you start thinking about particularly 9/11, you start thinking about the Twin Towers. I think about the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and I think about Pennsylvania, and I think about the makeshift memorials and the places that were set up with the notes of trying to find people who had been in the towers and if they had been able to get out. I think about the fire stations and the churches and local organizations that opened up to create sort of safe havens for family members to try to get more information and communicate. These are all places that we would look at, and these are across the board. I mean, in Oklahoma, they have a memorial that you can go to. Think about the Vietnam Memorial. These are places that we associate as a society as remembrances that are involved in this whole death system. We think about times, right? Clearly 9/11, we know the times, we have memorials. Last week was the Holocaust Day of Remembrance, right? Again, a time that alarms go off as to across the nation to signify when people were released from concentration camps. Lots of different timing elements, right? We have moments of silence in remembrance of when the Twin Towers were hit. And so we have that. These are timing, right? Timing also applies when you're just looking at funerals, and particularly this is very custom and culturally driven, is when funerals happen in relation to a death. So many cultures believe that the funeral should happen within 24 to 48 hours, and the burial should happen that quickly. Many other cultures sort of open that up for, within a week or two is when that happens. So timing, and again, this is sort of when we're thinking about society in general, how we kind of think about these elements. Objects and symbols, I feel like, really kind of go together. And again, we see these a lot of times with in mass tragedies with makeshift memorials, right? I just remember, goodness, it seems like we are inundated with media coverage of these sort of makeshift memorials and prayer vigils and things like that, candlelight services for people and tragic events, where even on the roads, when there's been a death at a particular place on the road, there's a lot of research actually on making those symbolic memorials on the roadside. And if those are helpful to those who are grieving, and or on the other side of that, distracting to other folks who are driving. There's some really interesting, if you're working on your media presentation, videos of sort of the debate on whether or not makeshift memorials on roadways should be allowed. So interesting topics there. Objects, again, related to 9/11. The first thing that comes to mind is the American flag on the heap of rubble with the firefighters, right? So things like that. objects and symbols. Another thing that I think of, I don't know if we have any Texans in the house, but in Texas, whenever a a funeral procession goes by and people are in their cars in the funeral procession, everyone on the street will stop and just put their hand over their heart to show that they acknowledge that there's been a loss and that people are walking through this grieving process. And so it's like a sacred moment when people go by, that they'll just stop and put their hand over their heart. A symbol of unity and understanding that we're all human. So other things, just even the funeral processional, right? We know that if we're on the road and we see, it used to be your headlights, right? The flashers are going, that you're just not going to cut in, right? You're not going to cut into the traffic because you're going to let those people stick together and proceed to the burial or wherever they're going. Now we've got those stickers, right? That are magnetic, stick on your car so that we know that it's a funeral procession. These are symbols and objects that we acknowledge as society that this is what we're going to do. Also, just talking on an individual level, not sure if you're familiar with this, but oftentimes when there's a car accident and someone has died, and the EMT are working on an extraction of someone who has died in a vehicle, they'll put a black sheet over the window just as they don't want people driving by and seeing someone in the car. So they they'll cover that so that there's some dignity in that and allow them to do the extraction without everyone driving by and seeing. So these are the kind of symbols that we're talking about. Okay, so for your discussion thread for this week, what I'm going to do is ask you to pick a mass tragedy. If you want to do an individual one, you can do that as well, and work through the death process of the people, places, times, objects, and symbols that are associated with that mass tragedy. So that's going to be our discussion thread. Here's a little news flash, okay? If this is something that as you're reading about the death system, you're thinking, this is really interesting, it's also going to be a midterm question where you can work through really in depth the death system on a mass tragedy and look at not only the elements, but also the function of the death system. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about the function of the death system. And that is really, there are 6 main points in sort of the function of all of this. And one is that as we sort of combine all of these elements together so that we can understand the death system and hopefully be able to warn and predict death, okay? So when we look at mass tragedies, there's always a conversation of why did this happen? How could we have known beforehand? How could we prevent these from happening? And when we talk about tsunamis and, we evacuate areas for hurricanes and things like that, this is all part of the death system, is this warning and communication about potential risk in order to prevent and predict when death is possible. Also part of this, all of these things, right, when we're talking about objects and people and things like that, we're thinking about who are the people and how do we care for the dead? How do we care for those that are in these mass tragedy situations that have died? How do we extract from the rubble? How do we take care of the dead? And then more so than even that is how do we dispose of the dead? We see from history lots and lots of different ways that we've disposed of the dead. We've got just here more recently in the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen more and more about cremation, burials. If you look, there's some great research on other countries, particularly in Japan, where they are, people are cremated. And then they have high rises that have almost like a bank where you can go in and visit the remains of your, you get a key card and you put it into the computer and it'll bring the remains of your loved one in so that you can spend time with the remains of your loved one instead of going to a cemetery. So lots of different ways that we've learned to dispose of the dead. Also, part of the death system is this idea that there's some social consolidation after particularly after mass tragedies. But on an individual level, we see that as part of sort of the funeral and the death rituals that happen after death, as there's just this the coming together of family and friends and community that creates this social consolidation. I don't know about you, but I remember when 9/11 first happened, right? And afterwards, there was like no air, there were no planes in the sky for a while there. So things were so quiet, but you could walk on the street and for a brief moment, some of these barriers between groups of people sort of just like melted away, and we were all Americans. And so people were kind to each other for a brief amount of time. Interesting, because that's what happened with 9/11. And when we look at some of these other mass tragedies that have been happening here more recently, even here in Baltimore with Freddie Gray and things like that, we see protests and we see things that maybe on some level are bringing some social consolidation to important issues, but also some division. So things to think about as we are evolving and this death system is evolving. Also, there's always a push to sort of make sense of death. So oftentimes with mass tragedies, what we see happen is that there's media who say, oh, well, again, it's part of that predicting. Well, this person didn't get mental health treatment, or they were in foster care, or they were, right, and they had this diagnosis. And there's always this sort of need to make sense of how this could have happened and why this happened so that we can try to predict and make sense of it. The challenge with a lot of this is this idea that oftentimes what happens is that it creates this us and them. I don't know about you, but I've been in situations where I've heard about these horrible school shootings and tragedies, and then they come out and they say all of the mental health issues, the laundry list of things that were wrong in their social situation and their mental health and all of those things. And it creates this us and them. Oh, well, clearly there's no one who's mentally unstable at my kid's school, right? Which we know is just a facade. We could go back to talking about denial at this point, right? So we really want to be cautious when we start trying to make sense of why these things happen, because we may miss the mark at times, right? And we could have lots of debate and conversations here about lots of different things, about stigma of mental health issues, about access to mental health care, treatment, gun control, all of those things, elements that we point to, partly part of this death system to make sense of why these things happen. And then also the last piece of the death system is killing. And then there are times when killing is considered okay, right? So when we think about 9/11, I think about, does anybody remember when Osama bin Laden was killed, right? There were people on the street that were partying and dancing and rejoicing when he was killed, right? So however you feel about that, we'll just kind of sidestep that. But as a society, we say that there are certain times when killing is okay and within the realm of possibility. So things like Osama bin Laden, times when we think about the death penalty, right? And I'm using the general we as social workers may or may not ascribe to that value system. But as a society, we say there are times, right, that killing is okay given certain situations. Okay, so there is a very sort of broad stroke information about all of the topics that we're going to go over this week in class. I know that I've talked really fast, but what I'd like you to do is in the discussion thread that I'm going to set up is to walk through identifying all of the elements of the death system and the functions of the death system for one mass tragedy. And you may need to do a little bit of research on just the topic, but again, this is a participation element. So I'm not looking for you to do a ton of research here, right? Just think of a mass tragedy that maybe you have seen media and then respond to that. All right, if you have questions, concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me. Take care.